Welcome to the Palestine Center's 2016 Summer Intern Lecture Series entitled Mobility, Israel's Structural Restrictions and Palestine's Resistance. Thank you for joining us today for the second installment of the series, Restrictions on Mobility, Structural Mechanisms and Physical Barriers, with Dr. Shira Robinson and Mr. Minem Maroof. Thanks also for bearing with us while we renovate our own conference room, but we're pleased we could use this space temporarily. My name is Abby Massel, and I'm one of the Palestine Center's summer interns, along with Sarah Dikshinsky, Zoe Reinstein, and Mirvet Salama. We decided on the theme of mobility as it is at the core of Israeli occupation strategy aimed at the dehumanization and subjugation of Palestinians. When discussing possible themes, we talked about the main tools of the occupation and their commonalities, such as the separation wall, the blockade of Gaza, legal barriers such as visas and the denial of the right to return, and the obstruction of Palestinian voices in international media coverage. We realized that all of these factors strategically restrain the physical mobility of Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, and the diaspora as a whole, but also the movement of ideas through censorship and media blackouts. Mobility is integral in defining and claiming spaces of living to affirm a community's identity, and therefore restrictions on Palestinian mobility are some of the most important, most apparent, and dehumanizing aspects of Israel's military occupation. That being said, Palestinians overcome this lack of mobility through publication, expression, and creation of their own platforms. They use media as a powerful tool in the spread of ideas beyond the walls of the occupation, which is ultimately a form of resistance in itself. After today's panel, please join us for the final installment of the lecture series on Tuesday, July 26, 1 p.m., with Leila Al-Haddad and Dr. William Youmans, entitled Overcoming Restrictions, Resistance Through Publication and Expression. We will end today's lecture with a question and answer period, and our live stream audience can send questions in via Twitter to @Palestine Center. Please take a moment now to silence your cell phones and any other electronic devices. Thank you.
Hello everyone and good afternoon. My name is Sarah Dikshinsky and I'm one of the interns at the Palestine Center this summer. As Abby just mentioned, today's lecture, Restrictions on Mobility, Structural Mechanisms and Physical Barriers, is the second in a series of 3 lectures on mobility in Palestine. Today's panelists are Dr. Shira Robinson and Mr. Minem Maroof. Dr. Robinson is an associate professor of history and international affairs at George Washington University, where she specializes in the study of colonialism, citizenship, nationalism, and cultures of militarism in the Middle East after World War I. She has served on the editorial committee of the Middle East Report, co-edited its blog, and contributed to other academic blogs such as the Nakba Files. She is also the author of the award-winning book Citizen Strangers, Palestinians and the Birth of Israel's Liberal Settler State, that was published in 2013. Her research has been funded by the Fulbright Institute, the Social Science Research Council, the Mellon Foundation, and the Palestinian American Research Center. Minem Maroof is a humanitarian activist and co-founder of the Beitona Foundation, a nonprofit organization that provides support in the integration experience for Arabic-speaking asylum seekers in the United States. Mr. Maroof is a founding board member of Hamda Center, which provides training in social media campaigning for human rights across Palestine. His work has also included providing resource development for Palestinian civil society organizations such as Musawa Center, Ilam, and Kayan, and most recently leading a team in Lesbos, Greece, to offer psychosocial support for Arabic-speaking asylum seekers arriving by boat. Dr. Robinson and Mr. Maroof will each speak for about 20 minutes, after which we'll have a short question and answer session. Would you help me in welcoming Dr. Shira Robinson?
Thank you so much for having me or for inviting me back. I came here about 2 years, a little more than 2 years ago when my book was first coming out. I'm so glad as a historian to be invited to this discussion about Israel's restrictions on Palestinian mobility. It's a cliche, but also true, that we often forget the past, especially when we're worked up talking about a present injustice, like the injustice of mobility restrictions on the West Bank and Gaza today. For years, it has struck me that both reporters and activists seeking to raise awareness about draconian movement restrictions on Palestinians in the occupied territories since the 1990s in particular, that these reporters and activists sometimes are unaware of Israel's past use of many of the same restrictions and techniques of restrictions inside Israel's 1949 armistice lines on Palestinians who remained in the country or managed to return to it after the 1948 war. Many of you may know that by the mid-1950s, most of this population, the population of Palestinians who remained in Israel, what became the state of Israel, or managed to return to it after 1948, most of that population, which was about, at the time, about 15% of the total population of Israel, most of them had gained citizenship in Israel as a result of the state's 1952 citizenship law. But that population remained nonetheless subject to a harsh military regime technically until December 1966, so for about 2 decades, just 6 months shy of the 1967 war and the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Israel's military law, which was the root of the military government, was itself rooted in Britain's counterinsurgency regulations that it formulated during the 1936 to 1939 anti-British, anti-Zionist Arab revolt in Palestine. And after 1948, the State of Israel awkwardly operated those British counterinsurgency regulations alongside the state's procedural democracy, a democracy in which the Arab citizen population technically had the right to vote. So there were these two different things happening at the same time. There were these military restrictions put in place on the entirety of the Palestinian population alongside the extension to that population of citizenship and voting rights. Now, today, the mainstream and alternative media pay much more attention than they did in the past to the racial chauvinism that has become much more explicit in Israeli political culture in recent years, and arguably, particularly since the 2014 Gaza war. This is great, the attention, but it's also deceiving in the sense that it gives the impression of something fundamentally new happening. And in fact, there are plenty of things you can read on this, but the racial incitement, government-sanctioned violence against the population inside Israel, and systematic discrimination in land, housing, education, municipal budgets, to name a few spheres of public life, have actually all been in place since the 1950s, and in large part thanks to the operation of this military regime. I just want to briefly mention a paradox that I came across during the course of the research for my dissertation and eventually my book that I really struggled with when I was in graduate school and that I kind of used the book to help me work through. And that is that during the entirety of the period between 1948 and 1967, i.e. the period between the establishment of the State of Israel and the Nakba on the one hand and the 1967 occupation on the other, Palestinians inside Israel lived under two sovereigns at the same time. The first sovereign in this sense was the Knesset, or the parliament in Israel. The Knesset created a rule of law that derived more or less from the will of the majority. Now, critically, that majority was a group that was Jewish only as a result of the displacement of Palestinian Arabs from what had been Palestine in 1948. So some of you may know, or most of you may know, that in 1947, the Arab population of Palestine was about 2/3 of the total population, and after 1948, the Arab population that remained inside the new Israeli state was about 1/8 of that slightly smaller territory. Nonetheless, as a part of the rule of law established by the Knesset, or Israeli parliament, some criticism within certain sanctioned political frameworks was allowed. Okay, so there was some parliamentary democratic system that was operating during this time. At the same time, the vast majority of Palestinians in Israel were forced to live after 1948 under a regime whose legal basis, as I've just suggested, derived from emergency regulations from the days of pre-1948 British rule and a permit system that was expanded after 1948, which severely restricted the mobility, residence, farming, work, speech, and political life of the Palestinian population. Under military rule, the sovereign was quite simply the person who was the military governor. He was the judge, he was the parliament, he was the judge, he was the prisoner. He was all of those things. And it was his job explicitly to suspend the rule of law enjoyed by Jews as a result of the Knesset. A host of regulations were imposed through this military government on Palestinians inside Israel, including censorship, controls on the marketing of goods and services, detention without trial, and home demolitions. But the most widely deployed emergency regulations were those that pertained to land and movement. And here we begin for the first time in the history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict to talk about closed zones. And we all today talk about the closure of Gaza, the closure of the West Bank to the rest of Israel. But the use of closed zones in a kind of systematic way really begins in the immediate aftermath of 1948. And just as a sort of small personal anecdote, I was thinking this morning on my way in how I could kind of make this story more real and alive. And I was recalling how when I was doing my field research, doing oral interviews, oral histories with older Palestinians who were alive in the 1950s and 60s, and this was during the height of the Second Intifada, so around from the spring of 2001 until the fall of 2002, I would always start off an interview by asking people, what is your name, where are you from, yada yada, and then I would say, so let's just have a kind of open-ended conversation. What are your memories? I would ask specific questions later on, but what are your memories or your most vivid recollections of military rule? And without, to a person, every single one of them said, what's happening in the occupied territories, closure, checkpoints, this and that. So here's an illustration of what at the time, or what today would be called what activists today call a flying checkpoint versus a fixed checkpoint like Kalandia, which we hear about all the time, or or other places in the West Bank. This was a flying checkpoint, and the way that a flying checkpoint would work is that if you were on the road, if you were walking on a road, or on a donkey on a road, or in a bus on a road, a policeman, usually military police, but not necessarily, would hail the bus over or stop you. And in the case of a bus, they would get on the bus and they would basically, first they might say, any Arabs get off, or show us your ID, or they might simply look at you, and if you had dark skin, they might say, you must be an Arab, get off. And the reason I mention the dark skin piece is because there were actually cases of Yemeni Jews being mistakenly identified as Arabs, and their IDs were checked. So that's something that we could return to as sort of and which I will return to, which is the racial nature of the enforcement of these regimes. So the way that it worked was, I'm going to see if I can get a slide here. There was, sorry. I'm not very technologically advanced. Okay, so this is a kind of confusing map from my book, but this is a map of Mandate Palestine, and the gray areas are the areas where there was supposed to be there was the proposed Arab state proposed by the UN Special Committee on Palestine in the fall of 1947, and the white areas were the areas where there was supposed to be a Jewish state. The map to your left is a map of what became of that territory of Mandate Palestine. Israel conquered about 78% of the total territory, and Jordan annexed the West Bank. Egypt decided to administer Gaza until Gaza could be part of an independent Palestine. In any event, there were 3 military zones that were set up in the immediate aftermath of Israel's independence and its conquest by the spring of 1949 of parts of what should have been the Arab state of Palestine, particularly in the Galilee, which I sort of outlined in pink, very inauspiciously there, or very crudely, and in this striped zone along the border, or what is today called the seam line with the West Bank. So the Galilee in the red was the North military government. The striped territory was called the Triangle, the Mithulath in Arabic, and the Mishulash in Hebrew. Muthalaf, excuse me. And then the Naqab, or the Negev region, was, it's hard to see on this map, but it was down here. And in the Naqab in the south, they literally just forced all of the remaining families and parts of existing tribes that had been living throughout the desert to live in a zone which they literally called the reserves, i.e. the reservations, invoking the Native American experience in the United States. But so there were these three military zones: north, center, and south. And in each of those, it was illegal to enter or leave without a permit. But on top of that, so first of all, it was illegal to enter or leave any of those three zones without a special permit. The zones themselves were not marked on a map. The maps that existed were not made public. And to this day, as far as I know, we do not know the maps, the actual parameters. So it's very easy, even if you wanted to be the most law-abiding citizen you could be, it was impossible except by virtue of experience of being arrested or hearing of your friends or family that were arrested, like, oh, you can't go 2 yards past the edge of the village of X because you might be in violation of such and such a military zone. But on top of that, within those three zones, there were multiple subzones that were closed off from each other. So you might find that if any given village was cut up into, if it was a large village, it might be cut up into 3 different military zones whose parameters were not marked. So once again, there were 2 facets to this. Once again, you could be arrested for an infraction you didn't know you were committing, but more importantly, or just as importantly, you could be arrested for going to visit your sister, or going to school, or going to the doctor, or trying to sell your produce, or going about your daily life in any number of myriad ways that all of us take for granted. It would be like as if, I might teach at GW and it would require me a permit to come give this talk, right? So, or much worse, it would require me a permit to go to the doctor, right? So anyway, so there were these unmarked maps indicating where you could and couldn't go. Now I mentioned the permit. The permit was a source of rampant abuse and corruption on the part of the military authorities. The only way you could get a permit from the military government was, normally, you had to go to a military government base, which was located in various villages throughout the country, and you had to stand in long lines, sometimes for hours, sometimes for a half a day or more, and hope that the governor would have mercy on you, essentially, or that his assistants would have mercy on you, and you would convince him that you really needed to go to the doctor or see your sister or sell your produce, or do whatever it is that you needed to do to help your family or to help yourself eat and get by. There were dogs sicked on, we know this from the newspaper reports at the time, there were dogs sicked on people in these lines, there was abuse hurled at people verbally and physically. You often were humiliated in all kinds of ways on these lines waiting to get your permit. And most of the time, if you were associated with the one political party that really allowed for dissent against this system, the Communist Party, you were immediately blacklisted from getting a permit. If you had been shown to express any kind of opposition to this very system that had you waiting in line, you definitely couldn't get a permit. So it was an extremely oppressive system. And today, when you ask, as I said, when you ask people, what do you remember about this? And also at the time when people said, what is the thing that you most hate about military rule? It was the permit system. And one of the interesting things about, just one more interesting or important thing about the permit system, just apropos our discussions today about the use of the term apartheid and its applicability, for a long time, for about the first 9 or 10 years of Israeli statehood, the government denied claims that the military government regulations were enforced racially. They said, no, any Jew who lives in this area or travels in this area is also subject to the same military restrictions. So if they get caught without a permit in one of these areas, they too will be tried on violation of permit restrictions. But we know that that was largely untrue, that maybe in 1 or 2 cases of radical leftist political dissent, Jews were brought to court, military court, and tried or fined for violating these movement restrictions. But in the vast majority of cases, it was strictly and exclusively applied to Palestinian Arabs. And we know this, the government denied this for years and years, and Palestinian attorneys were denying, Palestinian attorneys and newspapers were talking about how important it was that this was a racially enforced system, just like apartheid, and these comparisons were being made at the time, not just, in the 21st century, but back in the 1950s and 60s. And finally, there were some court cases and a state comptroller's report that said, no, this is being racially enforced and there's no doubt about it. So how do we... Of course, I just got a little excited and so I moved away. So how do we understand the fact that there was this kind of liberal citizenship, procedural democratic system in place where Palestinians could vote for prime minister and vote for members of parliament, and at the same time they were subject to this system that was completely violated the very idea of the rule of law? How do we explain this? And the most useful or effective way, I think, to explain it is to understand the relationship between land and people and the problems related to land and people that the Israeli government faced both before and after the partition resolution. So here I want to move back. Well, we can stay on this map. So when the UN, the United Nations, announced its recommendation to partition Palestine into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state, in November of 1947, it was expected that the Arab population that Arab citizens of Palestine would comprise nearly 50% or one half of the population in the would-be Jewish state. And in some cases, particularly in the Galilee and other parts of the country, the Arab population was expected to comprise roughly 80 to 90% of the population. Now, Resolution 181, which was the resolution passed for partition by the UN, oh my goodness, 5 minutes already, required each state to draft a constitution at some point soon in the future that would enshrine legal and political equality and the protection of property. So in a sense, Resolution 181 anticipated that there would be a mixed population. They said, that's fine, we're going to have an Arab state and a Jewish state, but since it'll be mixed, particularly in the Jewish state, because the Arabs comprise so many more people than Jews in Palestine, you're going to need to have things like a citizenship law that's going to ensure the equality of all people. Now, we know that in 1948, the Jewish community, or the Yishuv in Palestine, bypassed the liability of minority rule by expelling and coercing the flight of a huge part of the indigenous Arab population. But, as I've already told you, a sizable Arab population remained after 1948, roughly 15%, and the refugees on the other side of the border, particularly in Lebanon and Jordan, were trying to come home. So Israel, at the same time, after it conquered this territory, after it managed to carry out this demographic reversal that left Jews in the majority position in the state, it still had a problem that it needed to join the United Nations. And the United Nations required that every state have a citizenship law. Israel didn't have one, but it also got its first application to the United Nations rejected, in part because it didn't have a clear constitution or citizenship law. So the Israeli government was in a bind. It didn't want to grant citizenship and suffrage en masse, because if it did that, Arab citizens might actually legislate through the power of their vote the permission to allow refugees to come home. And so what it did was instead, and I'm going to shorten this very much, what it did instead was to institutionalize the kind of military authority that was established in every Palestinian village and town immediately after the war. Just like armies, when they occupy, they kind of set up shop, administrative shop. The government institutionalized the military authorities in each and every town. It consolidated them into these 3 big military zones, and it gave enormous authority to military governors to both freeze access to land and to try to prevent Palestinians from returning over the border. Now, I'm not going to go into the details here because we're clearly running out of time, but what I want to just say is that the military government left in place enormous structural disparities and inequalities in the country in terms of education, in terms of how you couldn't do anything without permission from the governor. You couldn't move to a new house, you couldn't go to university, you couldn't go to school, you couldn't go to the doctor, you couldn't do anything, you couldn't open a store, drill a hole for a well, anything, drive a car. So the military government put in place and left in place enormous structural disparities, as well as enormous fears on the part of the Jewish population of the Arab population, because there was a constant need on the part of the government to justify this complete segregation of Arabs from Jews. And the justification was usually on the basis of they will carry out revenge against the Jews for what happened in 1948 if we allow them to live their lives normally. So I mentioned that military rule ended technically in December of 1966, January 1967, December 66, just shortly, 6 months short of the 1967 war. And to understand kind of how to think about the relationship between the 1950s and today, it's helpful to think about why military rule ended in 1966. Formally December of 66, but it sort of went on through the spring of 67. And the reason it ended there were a few different reasons. And it did not result, the end of military rule, from a profound change in policy or principle about the Arab population. There was still a desire to make sure that people didn't return to their lands. There was still a desire to make sure refugees did not return to their homes. But there was a convergence of practical problems that had come onto the scene. Number one, Palestinian civil society activists had become more and more powerful in getting their message across, both to the international community, but also, and maybe in fact especially, to liberal Jewish citizens who were embarrassed about the kind of what seemed to those citizens to be kind of exceedingly retrograde policies, visible policies of discrimination. So liberal Jews were kind of coming around to the critique. Number two, this is really important, since 1959, there had been a recession in Israel in the 1950s, and that was lifted for the most part by 1959, and so you had the demand of employers for low-wage, low-pay Arab construction and service sector workers. One of the things that the military government did was regulate labor, the ability of Palestinians to get jobs outside of their villages, which were completely strangled economically. So the employers were pressuring the government to allow more Arabs to come and work for them. Arabs at that point still were barely a part of the National Trade Union Federation, so they could be paid less. And finally, and also critically, a younger generation of political and military officials in Israel, Jewish political and military officials became convinced that the majority of unsettled land, that is, land unsettled by Jews, was now out of Arab hands because of the military rules that had restricted Arab access to that land. And they became convinced that the state had other, more invisible means of controlling the Arab Palestinian population in order to continue to colonize parts of the country that were still largely Arab, like the Galilee and the Naqab, or the Negev Desert. So the argument on the part of this younger generation of government and military officials, security people, was we can remove the visible stain of discrimination without removing Jewish privilege. Okay, so this helps to understand, or this thinking helps to explain why the Israeli government undertook a massive new drive for land confiscation in the heart of the Arab majority Galilee in the aftermath of the end of military rule in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and why the government has kept the emergency regulations as well as key discriminatory laws and institutional practices firmly in place. Now, okay, so how do we get from all of this, which was a very quick summary, to post-67? And here's how you get to it. In the aftermath of 1967, there was a huge, which was just shy, just as this was ending, the permit restrictions were lifted. There was a huge construction explosion. Lots and lots of construction works were going on in the aftermath of 1967. The Israeli government was in a very good place economically, and there was a huge labor demand from Palestinians in the West Bank who were even less protected by labor laws than Palestinians inside, which meant they could be paid less, they didn't have to be paid Social Security, health insurance, occupational hazard insurance, things like this. And in the aftermath of the end of military rule inside Israel's 1949 lines, the government basically did a 180 in their official approach, and they said, oh, those retrograde military government officials inside Israel, they were terrible. There was so much bribery and so much construction. They looked so stupid, preventing old women and men from going to the doctor, and children were dying because their mothers were giving birth at checkpoints. Sound familiar? All of these, people couldn't get their medicine, and this just was so stupid. We didn't need this. We could have controlled them in a much more quiet, less obnoxious way. And so we're going to have, and this was according to Moshe Dayan, who was the kind of head honcho in the occupation regime after 67, and his policy was, everything that we did before, it was all stupid. We are a part of the enlightened post-colonial world now. We know what's going on in sub-Saharan Africa and South Africa and all these other places where colonialism is still going on or used to be going on. We're in a new era, friends, and that new era is about open bridges and open borders. And so let the Palestinians come into work in Israel. In fact, our policy is going to be a policy of non-interference. Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza will be, and he literally said some version of what I'm about to say, they'll be able to be born, go to school, get married, have jobs, raise their children, get old, and they will never have to see an Israeli soldier. And they're just going to come to work, and they're going to be happy with the refrigerators and the televisions they're going to get from all the cash they're going to make in our jobs, even though we're not paying them as much as the Jews, and it's all going to work out fine. And so that was kind of a fantasy, right? That politics, Palestinians would never have any political response or feelings about being under occupation. And so that idea was a flop, basically. And you have this intifada, I'm skipping a lot here, you have this intifada, this civil resistance uprising that starts in the very end of 1987. And as 1987 wears into 88, 89, and 1990, the relative openness of movement between Palestinians in the West Bank and Israel 48, and also between Palestinians in the West Bank and Palestinians in Gaza, begins to be clamped down upon. So I'm going to stop there. I think I might have gone over, and I apologize for that. And I'm going to let my colleague continue the story with post-Intifada number 1 and Oslo.
Okay. Hello, everyone. And again, for the Palestine Center, thank you for having me. So I will start then by talking about what happened. First, Intifada has been also seen as kind of a shock in the Israeli, let's say, public sphere, because of what you said. Actually, this system was really expected to work, and then, apparently, oppression cannot be tolerated. So that is what happened. I will move forward to the talks that happened after the first Intifada, and then to the Oslo Accords. And my plan is to have a focus on mobility and on restrictions. So I'm not denying other factors of what was happening at the time, but I'm focusing specifically on mobility and limitations. So what I'm planning to do is to get us chronologically to how from Oslo onward we got to this reality right now. So basically, I'm starting at a point in history where it was seen as a positive point where a peace process would be happening. The declared intentions of the Oslo Accords was to have the Palestinians having an autonomy in areas of 67 occupied in 67, and then Israel would have its recognition as a Jewish state in the region. That was the declared, let's say, intentions. But in fact, if we follow what really happened on the ground, the settlements in the West Bank that are illegal, and clearly, if you want some kind of Palestinian sovereignty in this area, you would need to get out all of these settlements, actually these settlements were expanded. And in that sense, maybe I'll have that open. Oh. So in that sense, what happened is that it was a precondition to have what's called natural expansion of existing settlements, continuing as the negotiations were happening and as the Oslo Accord was signed in 1993. So just to give you a picture of what does that mean, the natural expansion, from 1993 till 1995, and in 1993 and 1995 there has been major agreements signed. There has been 4,000 housing units built in these settlements. So even in this era, and I am a person that grew up in the Oslo period as a child that was seeing actually this as an opportunity for a new and more peaceful times, but clearly even at these times, 1993 to 1995, there has been still expansion. Now bear in mind, natural expansion of these settlements would be sounding like natural expansion like anywhere else in the world, but clearly natural expansion of the settlements was attracting settlers from other areas to these settlements, meaning it made no sense. You are actually just trying to grab more land. Coming with the settlements have arrived also what's called the bypass roads, Kvishim Okvim in Hebrew. And these bypass roads actually were acceptable to talk about them in the Israeli public sphere because it made more sense, because it grants security to the settlers in the West Bank, saying we want them connected to each other and we want them connected to Israel proper, and which is pre-1967 area. And in that sense, in reality, what happened is that these bypass roads have created separated areas, Palestinian areas inside the West Bank. So it managed to create cantons, if you want, inside the West Bank. And with those bypass roads came also the system of checkpoints and roadblocks and what's not in order to get that system in place. So we're talking about, if we are talking about these blocks, we're talking about the checkpoints, of course, change from time to time. The fixed ones are now around 96 checkpoints. They again, they developed with the bypass roads. So I was trying to make that sequence, see how what happened during the Oslo period has got us to the reality right now. Because these settlements have created these bypass roads. These bypass roads had the checkpoints and the physical, like let's say, obstacles. And now we're having them. So I'm saying like now I'm just telling the last count of them. April 2015, we're having 96 fixed checkpoints. And we have, out of these are 57 inside the West Bank. So instead of thinking that actually these checkpoints would be on the borders with Israel, 57 of them are inside, between those areas that were created by the bypass roads. And then you have the obstacles and the flying checkpoints that the OCHA, the UN Office of Coordination and Humanitarian Affairs, have counted 361 flying checkpoints in 2015. So this is also something to bear in mind. This is the reality that Palestinians in the West Bank are living on. So now that we have laid the system, how is it used? How does that affect Palestinian mobility? Well, there is this system of collective punishment that Israel enforces, And by collective punishment, we know that an action of individuals would be causing a punishment of whole communities. Usually, it's if it's an act of a person, then the house of the person's family would be demolished, and part of the family would be arrested. But also bear in mind, when we're talking about restrictions, that areas inside the West Bank and sometimes the whole West Bank would be blockaded, under siege, or closure, sorry. And again, just to remind, collective punishment is illegal by international humanitarian law, and this is an ongoing process. When we have any kind of incident that would be described as violence by Palestinians towards Israelis, this collective punishment is immediately expected, even within the Israeli sphere, and then you would have these kind of closures. So, as Dr. Julia in the previous lecture was talking about how unexpected a Palestinian life is, it is like that. You cannot plan tomorrow, because if something happened today, your tomorrow's plans are over. So, in that sense, the system of collective punishment influences the whole community, and it's continuous. Along with that, if we are talking about the West Bank now, and we'll move to Gaza later, we have the separation wall. So I just tried to make it more visible, and I can't find that. Actually, it's not moving. Oh. Yeah, I have a mouse. So let's try now. So I wanted you to just have a visual of what I'm talking about. I'm moving to the separation wall. After talking about what happened in terms of the system inside the West Bank, let's talk about how the separation wall its building started in 2002, and under the claim of security again, the separation wall is not complete, and in that sense, the claim that it provides security does not make any sense if the limitation actually is not being held by this wall. And in 2004, actually, this separation wall was being condemned by international community and being decided by the International Criminal Court that it's illegal and should be dismantled. The separation wall does not follow the internationally recognized armistice line in 1949, which is also called the Green Line. It actually 85% of it goes inside Palestinian territories. So if you can see the crossed Green Line, you have it here, and then you have the wall, and then you see all the areas that are confiscated as a result of building this separation wall. The separation wall also resulted in isolating a lot of communities that actually live between the separation wall and the Green Line, and they would need these communities would need permits in order to live in their own homes, and they would only be able to leave through gates that the Israeli authorities have set for their communities. And of course, if we go to the Jerusalem part of it, you would see that it is surgically working on separating East Jerusalem from the West Bank. East Jerusalem is also internationally recognized as occupied territories and is supposed to be part of a Palestinian state if the two-state solution is still viable. I don't see it possible. But also the wall has made sure actually that it is surgically removed from the West Bank. And what happened with the 250,000 Palestinians in Jerusalem is that most of them who are living in East Jerusalem are separated from their natural communities in the West Bank. And people who are in certain neighborhoods that Israel decided that it's not Jerusalem, for us it is Jerusalem, is now behind the wall in the West Bank, and they cannot access East Jerusalem itself. What happened in that sense is that they would also need permits in order to access. Some people have the residency papers, but they would still need to get to a checkpoint in order to get to the other side. One example is, my cousin is an accountant. She was living in Jerusalem, and she happened to live in a neighborhood that was separated from Jerusalem. 15-minute drive to her office turned into 2 hours drive because she needed to go to a checkpoint, and then although she has the papers. So still, when we're talking about this separation, it's specifically working on limiting the spaces of Palestinians and making mobility a privilege that the system can control, and in that sense can use that as a punishment. And from that, I would just last thing about the separation wall is that when it's if it's finished, when it's finished, then 10% of the land in the West Bank would be confiscated. 10% of that. Already, if we're talking about the area, it's already only 22% of the whole of Palestine for Palestinians. And then thinking about if this wall is completed, 10% of that 22% would be off. That's another thing to think about. From that, I would go to, okay, this, yeah. I'll go to Gaza. A lot of you already know about what's happening in Gaza, just the highlights, and then maybe in questions and answers we would get to things that would be specifically of your interest. In Gaza, as Shira said, there has been limitations starting 1988 from access of Palestinians from the West Bank to Gaza and vice versa. So the limitations started there. In 1994, Israel has built a wall around Gaza. Does it show here? Oh, it's not. Okay, I didn't even notice that. By the way, this is the number of checkpoints in case you wanted to take a look at that. So we're talking about a wall that also have a buffer zone inside Gaza, and the buffer zone actually confiscates 10% of the aerial land of Gaza. Why is that important? Because many of the cases of the owners of these lands trying to go and cultivate their own land was answered by live ammunition, by actually electronic gun machines that are controlled in centers inside Israel. And there has been a piece of that was very interesting, showing how that was operated, and it feels like the drone system here, because it's like video games. Basically, they would target someone they want to shoot, and they would shoot them, and a lot of fatalities have resulted from this action. So the people lost their lives just for going to the lands they were trying to, their own lands they were trying to cultivate around the wall. This is a piece of information that I think is worth mentioning. It's not mentioned enough. And the blockade first of all, the war has started in 1994. This meant also more restrictions on the movement of the population in Gaza from this time onward. But starting from 2005, there has been a blockade enforced on Gaza. That has been communicated by Israel as we have withdrawn from Gaza. Gaza now is not under occupation, and we have taken all the settlers. Actually, it is documented that Ariel Sharon, the prime minister who planned this move, have said that actually the settlements in Gaza have no economic value, and that's why we need to get them out. Or he said that it's not sustainable because it's costing us more than it's bringing any benefits. And that's how it started, and then the blockade started. And in that sense, Israel is promoting that we have pulled out of Gaza. Gaza is not under occupation, but according to international law, if you control the borders of this area, you control the movement of the people inside this area. You are occupying these people. So wow, okay. And this have been defined as an occupation. A lot of things can be said about Gaza. I don't want to feel bad that I didn't focus about Gaza, but I wanted specifically to talk about limitations of movement. And when we're talking about Gaza, we're talking about the ultimate of limitations of movement. It is happening up until now, over 10 years now, and today in Haaretz, actually, I just read an article saying that they are actually increasing the blockade, and they are revoking a third of the permits that were allowed. And we're talking about very small number of permits for very specific people and people with needs, with health needs, and with businessmen and women who would just bring products to Gaza and not get products out of Gaza, and still third of them will lose their permits as of this morning. That's the news that came from Haaretz. So meaning this the silence around Gaza needs to be stopped, and I think I believe that if you follow a new campaign that I just saw yesterday, you can contribute more. It's called Gaza in Context. Just follow that up. And last thing that I want to talk about is just to connect with what Dr. Judy was talking about, which is the perception of occupation and how it influences our perception of space. People who are under occupation, it's not only that physically are not allowed to go in and out from their area, but they also have lost something in their perception of space. And that is important to talk about, because our mental health or our mental conditions is a big part of how we perceive our future and how we perceive change into a better future. If Palestinians cannot perceive their space properly, then like me, then it's something that needs to be done first about that, and just bringing the connection between the physical limitation in mobility and what kind of influence it has on people who actually were born and grew up under this kind of restrictions. And last thing, and I don't think I will have enough time for that, but I'll just mention it, that there are initiatives that try to challenge that. Now that we have new technologies, we have social media, we do struggle to bring a cohesive space to us as Palestinians. That's why we always, as civil society, have projects that include people from the 48 area, from the 67 area, and Gaza. And one of these projects that try to challenge specifically the restrictions on the freedom of movement is called متحركين بالأجل فلسطين, and which is we're moving for Palestine. And متحركين لأجل فلسطين has been working with youth from the three areas, as I mentioned, three circumstantial areas, and they have been lobbying or advocating. Lobbying is not advocating the improvement of movement inside the occupied areas, and they started to talk about, for example, companies that benefit from these limitations. For example, HP being providing services to the checkpoints in the West Bank and Gaza. So these are, I think it's going to be a link to the next lecture. So these efforts exist, and they are, how do you say, for me, an indicator of hope and actually of change in the future. I wanted to show you a video, but then I'll leave it for you. It's called متحركين في فلسطين. You can see that it's amazing. Thank you very much. I hope it was useful.
Given everything that's been said in this lecture and the last one, and showing what the Palestinians are up against, I'm curious to know what the rationale for saying here in your own thing that somehow the Palestinians have overcome this lack of mobility. What does overcome refer to?
That's not my wording, so I don't know what you're referring to.
Yeah, that's the third lecture that refers to.
No, but it was on the first one and this one and
Yeah,
whatever.
this is the blurb for the whole series.
Well, I'm still, it's a good question, maybe. I don't know.
Well, maybe you can speak to
Again,
the movement.
You were talking about the worrying, but then I do understand. You were talking about, or let me understand that you're specifically looking how we overcome this restriction.
Well, I'm just repeating back to you what you wrote in your blurb here. It says the Palestinians have, quote, overcome this lack of mobility.
Yeah.
And it didn't sound like they're overcoming much.
Yes, sir. You're right. You're right. What you are reading there is a description of the next lecture that is talking about how activism is trying to overcome these limitations. There's an attempt to do that, and one of the things that activists in Palestine are trying to do is what I just talked about, this campaign of bringing people from these different areas. So I'll specifically, like, for example, what they have done is that they have collected videos from their areas, otherwise is not accessible to people from other areas. For example, I'm from the 48 area, and I cannot access Gaza. So they had these clips, and we collected them into like a 3 minutes video, where if you look at it, you would see Palestine, a cohesive space. And then we would address the issue of movement. What would have happened if we are able to access? So that's one of the examples.
I'm.
Your mic is there.
Oh, I thought only this one worked. I just was thinking about your question. I was actually kind of inspired by it. One of the interesting, I mean, what Minem is talking about is kind of emotional or psychological, the emotional surmounting of these barriers rather than the actual surmounting, because the government's restrictions are so tightly enforced. One of the things that's sort of potentially a lesson, a historical lesson that we might learn from, although I would have to think more about this, is the fact that in 1966, movement restrictions inside 1948 Israel were lifted, but the overall restrictions on Palestinian life and development were very much firmly kept in place. So the lifting of movement restrictions was kind of an easy target for activists because it didn't take away the ban on refugee return, it didn't dismantle the laws that ensured Jewish racial privilege in Israel. And so in many ways, even though it did make life easier for people, they didn't have to encounter police and military constantly checking their IDs at checkpoints, it didn't change the fundamental marginalization of the population in the country. And so in some ways, Israel was very smart and savvy in its dismantling of this visible stain, what was called a stain on the country, right, an international stain. And I don't know if one of the questions that I have moving forward as a researcher is whether Palestinian activists who were campaigning to end military rule understood that the government was going to make this sort of split, like we'll remove the visible stain but not the invisible issues. And if they just said, well, we need to do something to help our communities, or if they just, the government was faster than they were in thinking, and they sort of, and the government kind of got one step ahead of them. It's a question that I don't think has been answered yet sufficiently by historians, but either way, those are some of the thoughts raised by your question. Yes.
First of all, thanks to both of you for coming here and talking. My question is directed towards you, Dr. Robinson. I'm an aspiring historian in the Middle East, and a dominant trend I see in historiography is a push towards like objective history as somehow detached from current events. So your talk obviously draws a lot on what's happening in 48 and 50 and how that connects to the modern day.
Yeah.
My question is, what sort of pushback do you receive, if any at all, from the academic circles when you make these links between movements in the 40s and 50s towards like modern day scenario?
Well, I have been, for the most part, I try to stay focused on the claims that I'm making as a historian, and certainly in the introduction and the conclusion, for example, to my book, I very subtly, maybe not so subtly, but I don't hit you over the head with saying the X is the same as Y, but I am saying very explicitly these structural practices and laws were simply transported over the border in 1967 under slightly different circumstances. Of course, occupied Palestinians, the West Bank and Gaza, never were offered citizenship except for East Jerusalemites. So it's not like I'm only telling a history of the present, but I would say that one of the interesting responses to my book from people who are sort of sympathetic to the idea of pre-67 Israel being a kind of golden age of Israeli democracy is scholars of that bench often say to me, I loved all the chapters of your book, but the intro and conclusion were terrible. They were just completely polemical, and all this talk about settler colonialism just drove me crazy. It's just a big polemic. And so it's really interesting. I mean, certainly everyone is entitled to interpret the facts as they interpret them, so that's a legitimate move to make. But it has struck me that there's often that often corresponds to a political orientation that I was actually directly trying to reach. I'm trying to reach that audience that thinks that Israel before 67 was somehow a kinder, gentler state, and I'm arguing that it never was a kinder, gentler state. And I argue that specifically, or I make that point specifically so as to say, wake up, policy community, 67 is such a huge problem, and like my colleague said, there's not about to be a two-state solution. But even if we woke up tomorrow and the circumstances were completely changed and we could have two states, there would still be a big mess on all of our hands, which is the contradictions between, with contradictions of Israeli policy and society that will remain as a result of the inconclusiveness of refugees living over the border and Palestinians inside being discriminated against.
It's kind of an open question for both of you. With all these restrictions on Palestinians on both sides of the Green Line, there's also I think quite an opening in movement, and that's actually the movement of Palestinian citizens of Israel into the occupied territories for a wide range of reasons. So I'm wondering kind of your takes on what kind of impact does this ability of movement for Palestinian citizens have on society, on the politics, on new generations, maybe the different views on the Palestinians on the Israeli side versus the Palestinians on the in the West Bank. Of course, Gaza is not included. But yeah, I'm wondering your takes on that kind of thing.
Well, me too. Basically, things have been. This reality that is not that you're talking about now is possible because the shift, in my opinion, in the Palestinian identity inside the 48 area after the second Intifada. And I think it became possible because we have started as the third generation, have developed and grew up in that area, have started to see the cohesion and identity, and then it became possible. Before that, there has been visits. We would see families from other places, from the West Bank specifically, but not thinking about us living in Ramallah, for example, making a lot of sense.
of course, it comes with opportunities. It comes with more of what happened to Ramallah at this period of enjoyization, if I might say that. And a lot of the opportunities have also attracted people from the 48 area. So I would see that as the main reason for someone to move in. But it's still amazing for me that actually it feels natural for us to do this movement. Unfortunately, there is not possibility to do the movement otherwise, and having people from the West Bank coming and working in our organizations and in the Palestinian civil society in 48. But still, by the fact that it's happening means that the cohesion and identity can show a vision of change that can challenge the status quo that is enforced by the Israeli occupation. I hope that makes sense.
Hi, Phil Schrafer. I guess I'm addressing this to both of you. Dr. Robinson, you mentioned, of course, the point that the Arabs in Israel have the voting right, and Netanyahu in his last election said the Arabs are coming, because they're going to take the seats in the Knesset. In fact, they formed, 3 of them got together. One was the Communist Party, 2 of them. The point is, if you look out 10 years, their population, their demography is growing so much faster than the Israel population. They should acquire more power. That's my question. My one comment is, hoisted on your own petard, as I understand it, there's an ultra Jewish population now, small, 5%, but where they look at the Zionists as enemies. They attack synagogues. They refuse to serve in the military service. But and the government has to deal with this. That's my point. Only 5%, but maybe 30% of the preschool population belongs to the ultra orthodox. So they've got their problems too.
I mean, there's still many mechanisms that Israel has been using to great effect to control a large Palestinian minority, and I don't think those mechanisms will go away. And Palestinians inside Israel are denied access to something like 93% of the land inside the state, and I don't think, and it's that exclusion from access to that land has been carried out not only through official government institutions that might be changed by the law, but also semi-private institutions like the Jewish National Fund. So mechanisms of exclusion and marginalization come in all shapes and sizes in Israel like they do in this country and elsewhere. So just gaining numbers is not necessarily going to pose a threat to the system.
Bear in mind that this issue of demography, the demography was started or continued the securitization of the discourse around what's happening in Palestine. It's clearly a settler colonialist project, and we're talking about the aim is to have more land and less Palestinians on it. And in that sense, what you are describing, this issue of demography or having more Palestinians, I think it's understood that it will not have any influence because the system in place has clear privileges for a certain ethnicity, for a certain identity, let's say. So whether they're a majority or a minority, the system will still be in place, and that is the thing that needs to be challenged, and not how many Palestinians or ultra-Orthodox. I do understand your claim, absolutely. And to add to what you were saying, also, a lot of now the Israeli society is out of the identity that was enjoying the privilege, the Mizrahi Jewish society. They're not part of the people who would say we're the builders of this system, and we have or they own Zionism, let's say, or started the Zionist ideology. So that is also going to be challenging, but still, as long as the system is based on bringing privileges to a certain identity, no matter the demographic division in the area, it will still be in place unless it is challenged.
I'll just add one more quick thing to that. I actually think that what changing the constantly evolving demographic balance will do and has been doing is scaring the Israeli leadership. And so I think that's one of the explanations, by no means the only, and we were talking about this last week, but that explains in part this wave of new legislation targeting Palestinian political work inside Israel. The NGO law, the nation-state bill, the amendment to the citizenship law, which prevents Palestinians inside Israel from living with their married partners, their spouses from the West Bank or Gaza, or from another quote-unquote enemy territory. So all of these things, so the more that Palestinians, my sense, and you can say if you agree, but the more that Palestinians not only exist, but demand their equal rights inside Israel, the more the government will find ways to clamp down, the more crisis that will create, the more bad press Israel will get, the more it will clamp down more in reaction to that bad press, and then we'll see what happens. But I think there's a dynamic that's unfolding as a result of all of this.
I agree.
All right, we have time for probably one more question, so make it a good one.
Yes.
This one's for both of you. What do you guys feel like, or how would you answer or address the Palestinian Authority's role in the restrictions of mobility? And how does it cope with Israel's pressure to keep this system in place?
You start.
I know it's a big, broad question, but I felt like the Palestinian Authority wasn't mentioned at all. Like, where do they play in this? Because the whole tasarih, like, permit thing, you have to really go through them and pull some strings to go places.
Yeah, I mean, I really can't speak to, from personal, I've never had to deal with them, obviously, maybe not, I've never had to deal with them, and I don't actually hear many stories about dealing with them, because at the end of the day, yes, they sort of play this role in between the Palestinian population in the territories, or in the West Bank and Israel, but Israel pulls the strings. So I've never seen any report to the effect that the PA's demand for loosening of restrictions, or what Israel often calls alleviations, has made any impact.
The PA is basically a civil management of the occupation. That is the role it's functioning, it's taking right now. Not to state any position against them, it's just that's where they have been put. And in that sense, they are part of the occupation, they are part of the system. And if we're talking about security issues, they are even enforcing the policies of Israel, unfortunately. So in that sense, I would see them as part of the occupying system.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.